Welcome to Faith and Sustainability, a podcast where we look deeper at how our faith traditions inspire us to care for our common home. I'm Leonard Robinson, your host and tour guide.
And I'm your co-host, Kat Doyle. This podcast is made possible from the generous support of Jamie Lanier, the Varlamov Family Foundation, Georgia Interfaith Power Light, St. Francis Services, and Semco Atlanta. Okay, Leonard, we've come to the end of a second year, the end of a season, and we really have a unique guest to take us out with a bang this season. Tell us who's with us today.
Well, Kat, our special guest today is Reverend Canon Sally Bingham, a pioneering voice in the intersection of faith and environmental stewardship, an Episcopal priest and canon for the environment in the Diocese of California. She has spent over 3 decades mobilizing religious communities to confront climate change as a moral imperative. She is the founder of the Regeneration Project, which launched Interfaith Power Light, a national network of over 18,000 congregations across 40 states committed to climate action, and she is one of the first religious leaders to frame global warming as a moral issue, inspiring thousands to embrace energy stewardship and advocacy. Sally, welcome to the intersection of faith and sustainability.
Well, thank you, Leonard, and hi.
I think that was a mouthful. That's a lot. You have an incredible story. Sally, maybe we can start off by going back to the beginning and sort of telling us a little bit about how your life got you to where you are today. And I realize it's a long story, but maybe give us a little summary, a snapshot, if you will.
Well, I have been an Episcopalian all my life. And before I even get into that, thank you for having me on the show, because I love talking about this work. It's existing beyond me, which is really great. I was sitting in a church in San Francisco, having moved from New York to San Francisco, an Episcopal church. I had never been a zealot about religion, but I was listening to the priest talk about loving God and loving your neighbor. And I was on the board of the national organization called Environmental Defense Fund. And EDF had me on their board. And at every board meeting, I was learning more and more about what negative effect humans were having on the planet. And I couldn't quite understand how we as Christians could sit in a pew and say we love God and love our neighbor, and then be polluting our neighbor's air and throwing trash in their yards. And that's really how it got started. It was my faith saying, hey, religious people have to take care of creation. God put Adam in the garden to till it and to keep it. And we're not doing that. And that's where it kind of stirred in me that if I know what humans are doing to the planet, I need to let other people know, and particularly the people who don't normally hear about things like overfishing or climate change. Certainly they don't hear about it from the pulpit. So that's really, that was the beginning. And that's when I decided, okay, I'm going to make sure that everybody that sits in a pew and says they love God are going to become caretakers of creation.
Oh, that was a huge ask of yourself.
That was. So you got to the intersection of faith and sustainability. It kind of dawned on you. What moved you to advocacy? How did you get to that next level?
Well, I think that's where God enters in. I was not an environmental zealot, and nor was I a religious zealot. But I couldn't sleep at night knowing that people who call themselves Christian and go to church and say they love God were destroying the planet. And that's where I just thought, I have to do something about this. But I went to my bishop here in San Francisco and said, I think I better go to seminary. And he said, well, what for? And I said, because I want to know how the Christian community can justify destroying creation. And he backed me, but he said, he asked me out of conversation, where did you go to college? Well, Leonard, I'd never gone to college. I was 45 years old and I'd never been in college. And he said, well, you can't go to seminary until you go to college. So at 45 years old, I entered the University of San Francisco and studied religion. That was my primary major. But secondly, I was studying psychology. And that was so I could figure out what I was doing in college at 45 years old. And one thing led to another. I ended up in seminary 4 years later and met another student at CDSP, which is the Church Divinity School of the Pacific. I met another man who was very interested in the same thing. He was an ecologist. He was smarter than I am, but he said, well, why don't we start giving classes in Sunday schools and in churches for environmental stewardship? We called it, and when we started out, climate change was not such a big subject. This is now the early 90s. And as time went on, we were beginning to learn that the climate was changing and humans were causing it. So that's when we became Episcopal Power and Light. And for several years, we just went around to the Episcopal bishops and Episcopal churches in California and in Massachusetts, where the other person was from. And one thing led to another. We got a phone call from the Rockefeller brothers saying, is this just for Episcopalians? Or if we fund you, could you take this national and go with all the religions? And we said, well, sure. And that's when we hired Susan Stevenson. And she's been with me ever since. She's really the backbone of this whole organization. She's so modest, she'll never tell you that, but she would push me forward and she'd tell me what to say. But that was really, I can't take a lot of credit for the starting of it, because there were so many people who said, this is great, including the foundations that give money for environmental work, because they realized that we were talking to an audience that was not a member of the Sierra Club. These are people who had probably never heard about environmental stewardship, but they were hearing it from their priests. And it's an organic ministry. It just got bigger and broader and more accepted. Nobody ever said you shouldn't be doing that. It was always encouragement.
I love that. It's very interesting that you turn to God and religion to answer those questions that you said were keeping you up at night. And then to talk about taking what our faith calls us to do onto a bigger stage and talking with people outside of your own faith tradition. Can you tell us a little bit? So once you got the funding and you got the idea to kind of go national, what did it look like? What were your goals? What did you think you were setting out to accomplish at that point?
Well, as I say, it was organic. I never, particularly when I was getting ready to go to college and talking to the bishop, first, I had no intention of ever being ordained and becoming a priest, nor did I say, I'm going to have this national organization that's going to, touch all different religions. It just happened. And I wish I could tell you, oh, well, I did this, this, and this, and this, but I didn't. I was in the right place at the right time when people needed it and really wanted to have more information. And you can't just, we found out the hard way that you can't make people feel guilty, because that doesn't get you anywhere. So we just talked about your responsibility as a human being to take care of the planet. And we could put it in Jewish language, Catholic language, Presbyterian, all major religions, really, really all of them have some kind of a principle of taking care of creation. There's no religion that says, let's just use up all the food and use up all the grain and let's wreck everything.
Wouldn't be much of a religion.
How does the Regeneration Project relate to Interfaith Power and Light?
We didn't have money to start with. And the Regeneration Project was the name that we had chosen. We were going to regenerate religion. We were going to regenerate care for creation. And when the Rockefeller people, who were the first group to give us any funding, we didn't have anyone to give it to. We had to have a 501c3 that would be our fiscal agent. And we put our money in the Tide Center, which is an organization that acts as a fiscal agent for lots of nonprofits. And so we were the Regeneration Project for probably the first 3 or 4 years. But then mid-90s, climate change became the subject. And how did we fit climate change into the regeneration project? We just decided, what about power and light? Because that's what it was all about. How do you use your energy, and where does your energy come from? And therefore, when it was actually Woody Bartlett, do you remember him from Georgia? Well, he started the Georgia Interfaith Power and Light, and I didn't know him, but he got in touch with me and said, would you come to Georgia and help us get one of these programs started? And we did, and we decided that if he was head of an Episcopal church, so this Episcopal Power and Light was very resonant. Everybody liked that name, thought it was funny, and they kept asking us, well, which one's the light and which one's the power? But it was great fun doing that. And then Massachusetts wanted to do the same thing. Again, it was the Episcopal Church. And then there was, in Washington, D.C., it was a rabbi who was interested. So and then, oh my goodness, it just grew. The religious groups and heads of them that heard about it came to us. That's when we realized that we weren't just Episcopal churches. We were becoming synagogues and Catholic churches and Presbyterian churches, and in some cases temples. So we became interfaith. So now the Regeneration Project's big focus is on interfaith power and light, and it took off from there. So now you have, and I think you said 18,000 congregations. There are actually 22,000 congregations.
I stand
Even
corrected.
Better.
I stand corrected.
It's very interesting as you've been talking about the different faiths coming into play here. One thing that's sort of in the back of my mind I'm hearing also is you were a woman religious, a ordained clergy, taking on some things that were oftentimes organizations that may have been very patriarchal and kind of a man's world, not because only men could do it, but because men were the ones that were doing it. Did you run into any kind of issues being a female woman leader, faith leader in this fight against degrading our climate and degrading our earth?
Well, that's a great question. Because yes, not so much lately or in the last 10 years, but in the beginning, if I was giving a presentation somewhere, often, and it would be usually a man who would stand up in the back and say, if you listen to this little woman, you're going to end up washing your clothes on a washboard. You're going to be back in a horse and buggy. You're going to use candles in your house. And there were derogatory remarks about cutting our electrical use and cutting our energy. And it was hard to convince people that the climate was really changing. I mean, you all know there are people in our administration that call climate change a hoax. So not only was I a little woman, I was trying to convince everybody that humans were changing the climate, and here's how it was happening, and we had to cut back on fossil fuels. And so yes, the beginning was difficult, but eventually people began to catch on, and I had the backing of Environmental Defense Fund and all of their information, and I had brochures I could hand out that were professionally done that showed the numbers and the statistics, and then it became just overwhelmingly successful with folks like you calling and asking me if I would come do a presentation, or could I help their church go solar, or is there some way that I could speak to that congregation? And I did it. I went all over the country. And then one of the really exciting benefits of being in this work is I went to Kathmandu with some really famous people doing a big march, and our project, Interfaith Power and Light, was called A Sacred Gift to the Planet. And we walked in with other religious leaders. The clergy from Assisi came, the St. Francis monks. And then I went to Turkey and met the ecumenical patriarch Bartholomew. I didn't go there because I called him up and said, "Hey, Bart, can I come over?" No, I was
Hey, Bart, this is Sally. I'd like to drop by.
I was actually invited, and I stayed in his home in Istanbul, and it's just been an amazing adventure. And I've met some extraordinary people who all think this is something that really has to happen.
I love this that you've been this woman kind of standing up, unafraid to speak out and to speak up, and in a world where we're daily trying to encourage our young girls and our women to get into the STEM type of work. Talk to me maybe a little bit about how you would encourage the next generation of faith-filled women to find their place and find their voice in this work.
Well, that's a great question, and hard for me to answer in a way, but I will tell you, you're onto something, because when somebody would get in touch with Interfaith Power and Light at the office level and say, how can we get our church involved in this? It was always a woman. And our answer was, go to the rector of your church and ask if you can start an environmental committee, and then go in and find out who's interested in environmental work, who's interested in getting rid of the styrofoam cups, who wants to switch to compact fluorescent light bulbs, who understands turning out the lights will save you money. And they were nearly always women. And so our little environmental teams would start up led by women in these various congregations around the country. And as far as the youth, that's hard, because in the Episcopal Church, and I think in a lot of churches now, there are not a lot of youth going to church. Not that they don't think it's important, but our culture I have two little grandsons. They don't go to church. They play soccer and baseball on Sunday morning, because that's when the teams play. And it's taken, occasionally we can bring one or the other of them into the church if I'm preaching that day, but churches and religion is not a part of young people's lives today. It's really too bad. I think some of the religious schools are still helping with that. And if you do talk to teachers, rectors, any ministers of any denomination, they will agree that the youth need to be involved in all this. And of course, you have folks like Bill McKibben, who's gotten millions of kids around the world involved, and they're all young people. But I think it might be a little bit of a stretch to say that our Interfaith Power and Light has brought children in, although they certainly, if they're in the congregations and they hear it being talked about, maybe they pick, but nobody has called me and said, I was 5 years old when somebody came and talked about Interfaith Power and Light at our church, and now I want to do that ministry. But we did influence the seminaries enough so that you can take a class now in environmental stewardship. And it didn't used to be. When I went to seminary, I entered seminary in 91, I guess. We couldn't, there were no classes in environmental stewardship or environmental ethics, but they're all there now. So that will inspire younger people.
We definitely thank you for that influence that you had, because it is spread throughout, I think, the seminaries of most faith traditions that this type of classroom work is available, and that we have ordained clergy who are now standing up and preaching about this from the pulpit.
Well, Sally, I want you to get in front of the pulpit and give us a call to action.
The altar call is vote for legislators who know that the climate is a problem, and resist anybody that's trying to tell you it's not a problem or we're not causing it. I'm now an advisor on the Union of Concerned Scientists National Board, and I know even more now than I did 30 years ago about the science and what's happening. And it's a hugely serious problem. And everyone in America should know about it, whether you're a religious person or not. And we need to cut down on the amount of coal or gas that we use. We need to cut down on plastic and any kind of waste. And if you're a religious person, you have an obligation to do that. You are called to be a steward of the garden, God's garden.
I love it. You know, we just had an episode about plastics and the issues around plastics, so we like hearing different people address this from different ways. We want to thank you for taking the time to be with us today. I think that not only have you identified some of the issues, but I feel a hopefulness. I feel like you believe, and we're all called to believe in hope. Isn't that what our faith calls us to embrace as we're doing this work? So thank you for bringing us that message.
Anybody who wants to know my kind of life story, it's on a YouTube video. It's called Reinventing Sally Bingham. And the producer's name is on there. He has since, I think he passed away about 4 years ago, but his last name was Kennedy. He made a wonderful film about 4 people in the United States who were working after they were 60 years old and what they were doing. And my story, he just does a beautiful job. And so I recommend Reinventing Sally Bingham if you want to know anything more about me.
That's a wrap for today. For our listeners, stay connected with us on social media and share your thoughts using the hashtag Faith and Sustainability.
This is the end of a season. We're going to be taking a few weeks to regroup, a little rest and relaxation before we get on to the next season. We want to thank everybody for being with us. Don't forget to like and subscribe and leave us a review. Tell us a little bit about who you liked, what you thought was interesting, so that we can make sure we're bringing you great stories in the future. Until next time,
we'll be right here at the intersection of faith and sustainability.
The preceding podcast is a production of the Roman Catholic Archdiocese of Atlanta. Copyright 2025.